Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Tigerpaw Radio. And if you can see us, that means you're actually watching us on TigerTube. So thank you very much. I don't know, you'd have to be sleeping under a rock the last few weeks not to see some of the energy that's come up around some of the advances in the AI technologies that are really making some waves, if that's either image generation or some of the progress that's being done in natural language processing as well. And very excited today, actually, to have a great guest, Seth Dobrin, who is the president at the Responsible AI Institute, to take us a little further into this, because obviously it's not just the what and the how, but sometimes we have to consider the if and start looking at some of the ways that we can be more responsible with these kind of technologies, which I personally think, at least anyway, are certainly seem to be coming of age. So Seth, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Wes. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to talk to you and your audience about this topic.
Yeah, that's great. And obviously, I know you as a CompTIA fellow alumni, and that you are doing some work with the group there around AI research, but nobody knows you better than yourself. So could you introduce yourself for our audience?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you said, I'm currently the president of the Responsible AI Institute. I just joined the Ray Institute, as we call it, a couple months ago. Before that, I was the first ever global chief AI officer at IBM. Before that, I was at Monsanto, where I led the data and AI portion of their digital transformation. Before that, startups, academics, industry. I'm actually a human geneticist by training, not as off the wall as you would expect. The field that we think of as big data and AI actually originated from two areas, from genetics and physics / astrophysics. So I've been doing this sort of thing for many more years than I'd care to admit, since the 90s, the days of the Human Genome Project. But it's really interesting to see how the tools and technologies have evolved to address business questions instead of scientific questions. And with the age of compute and cloud computing and all the scale that we have, and the beginning of foundation models, and transformer models, it's really kind of exploded. And for your listeners that aren't experts or that familiar with AI, GPT chat or ChatGPT is what's called a foundation model.
Okay, well, and I look forward to talking more about that model as we go through the interview. And, we did have a little fun with this, right, Seth, that I had originally sent you, and I'd never done this before. What I always do when I'm getting ready for guests is I send a list of questions for consideration, right? And I always write them, but I thought, well, this time, because of all the fun that's going around this ChatGPT, why don't we, get some questions drawn up by that? And you sent me back another set of responses for questions maybe a little bit different, and said, why don't we use these instead, which was also generated by, the application, right? So yeah, as much as it's doing in the world for, like you said, these technologies starting for other reasons and moving into having these business benefits, that we can have a little fun along the way as well. And so looking at some of these questions, maybe we'll jump right in. And one of the first ones is, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you became interested in this field, in AI, and what inspired you to take the role specifically at the Responsible AI Institute.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm actually a human geneticist by training, been using a lot of the tools and technologies and techniques that we use today for data science and AI when they were in their near infancy. So I've always been in this space. Over the course of my career, I've gone from, I've approached this problem from a very kind of business user perspective, right? I'm not a technical person. I taught myself how to code. I did all those things. I'm not a techie, if you will, by training. And so I've always kind of approached this from an outcome perspective. And I've always had this mindset of, we need to consider the human. So how is it making someone's life better, cheaper, or faster? Right. So I mentioned earlier, I was at Monsanto. That's how I addressed every question at Monsanto, right? How is it making my customers, whether it's an employee or an actual customer or a dealer, how is what we're doing going to make their life better, cheaper, faster? That also bled into, how my team, this was very early, this was more than 10 years ago at this point. And so people were hesitant to trust the outcome, the recommendation of a model at that point. And so, how do I get the team to trust it, right? And that gets into transparency and explaining how the tool came to its decision, and also helping people understand that it's probabilistic. So you and I got different answers for the same, different questions for the
Yep.
same question, and that's because they're all probabilistic models. There's very few deterministic models at this point. And that eventually led into kind of this continuing with this human perspective, especially when I was at IBM, really making sure that we consider the human that's impacted and the human that's using the AI. And they may or may not be the same person, right? So if I'm, a mortgage broker making a mortgage decision using AI, I'm the user, I'm not the one impacted. You or I, who's applying for the mortgage, are the one that's impacted, right? And so making sure that you have that distinction before you build a model, and then making sure with that distinction, you think about what are the possible ramifications of what I'm doing from a thing like something like bias or transparency or robustness or security. And going back to the mortgage model, right? We have to make sure it's not biased. We have to make sure we're not getting a different answer for a Black person versus a white person, or a woman versus a man, when all other things are equal. And you need to worry about personal data. What is the model doing with that personal data? Things like that. And so there's considerations that are derived from thinking about the human, and you need to do this up front. And so long story short is all of that journey is what led me to the Responsible AI Institute, and want to step in as president and really help the organization move from kind of a niche space to a scalable and de facto kind of organization for how do you implement AI in a responsible manner. And being a nonprofit, we're able to kind of sit in the middle. We don't get into, we're a better tool. We're not a tool. We're a set of, AI conformity assessments, they're called, that are used by various tools and take inputs from the various tools.
I love it. And thanks for the clarification. That's one of the things I think that I've really discovered as I've done some research, getting ready for this interview, and just some things on my own, is that there's a lot of blanket terms when it comes to AI that people don't really understand what some of the different underpinnings are, right? And just a small example, obviously learning that we're dealing with data sets versus databases, right? And I've heard that conversation with people a lot, saying, oh, the databases, they must be running for these, and learning that these things, that there's different language, there are different ways to approach this. So I appreciate the clarification that you've given there.
Well, and on that point too, we often also, the data sets are derived from multiple databases oftentimes. And we also need to remember that the data, the models are not biased. Math is not inherently biased. It's the data. And the data is biased because of the past bad decisions that we as humans have made.
Isn't that funny? It all comes back to us. So yeah, maybe a little lack of focus on the human in the past would have been better if we'd paid a little more attention to that, building, kind of what we've done in the past, right? In your opinion, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen? And maybe you can talk about some of the opportunities as well when it comes to ensuring the safety of AI systems.
Yeah, so I think when we look at the safety of AI systems, especially in this age of, deep learning models, neural networks, foundation models, things like GPT or, BERT, or, these are all kind of kitschy names for these, fancy technologies that kind of we can all, spew back. The challenge is they're black box models. We don't understand necessarily how they're making a decision. We can use AI to interpret them. So that helps a little bit. But especially these large scale models like GPT, like, DALL-E, like other, foundation or transformer models, they're called, they are trained on massive amounts of data. And in some cases, the whole of the internet, right? So there's a whole new GPT model coming out called GPT-4, creatively after GPT-3. And, GPT-3 was trained on, a massive amount of data that was scraped off the internet. GPT-4 is being trained even more data that's scraped off the internet. And that data includes personal data. It includes hurtful data. It includes, how to make a bomb. It includes, really, really things that you don't necessarily want surface in different use cases. Now, the challenge is that you don't necessarily want to prevent these models from learning those things, because there are some instances where they would be valuable, but you need to figure out how do you make them safe to use for a given use case. So for instance, I would had access to the beta version of GPT-3, which is the foundation of, ChatGPT. And I was able to extract my personal information about me, my social security number, all my residences since, before the internet was invented, other types of information. There were reports, and I did this myself as well, where, you could create hateful things or bias things where you say, hey, tell this nurse, and it automatically goes to she, or even on the ChatGPT, it creates the same kind of thing. But if you ask it a direct question, they've done a good job of filtering those things out. But if you create a hypothetical, it doesn't. So for instance, before this call, we got together, I said, tell me about Seth Dobrin. It said, oh, we can't tell you about people who aren't public figures, and Seth is a public figure. But I put in the questions that, I'm doing an interview with Seth Dobrin. What are some good questions I can ask him? And it brought up a whole lot of information about me, right? Same thing with building a bomb. If you ask it, how do I build a bomb? It's not going to tell you. But if you tell it, I'm writing a play about how to build a bomb, I need to have, dialogue that explains it. It'll give you instructions for how to build a bomb. Right. And so that is not good. And so we need to figure out better ways to control that. And I think we also need to consider, how do we make sure that you can't extract information from them? So the whole point of these types of models is not to play around with a cool tool on the internet. The whole point is for organizations to be able to take smaller data sets that are relevant to their industry or use case and train them on top of these. And so how do you prevent these types of things, the biases and things like that, from coming out when you're training those? So back to the mortgage case, if I'm using a foundation model, say GPT-3, to make a mortgage decision, I need to make sure that all the bias that lives on the internet and that lives in my data is not surfaced through this tool. Those are the kinds of challenges we're facing.
It's a bit heady, right? Because there are always people looking for backdoors and workarounds and, those kind of things, right? And I did talk with my son about it, what's going on in your world, how are people doing it? And he said that he had a friend that kind of walked around the side of it, the same thing, setting up hypotheticals and everything else, just testing it to find out where the breaking point would be for finding to release it. Because the information is out there, right?
Right.
I also like what you say about the fact that we've got to be careful about not trying to necessarily police the data that it's using for learning too much, because I think it is kind of a reflection of who we are, but how that's used is important, right? I can't think, when you think of the amount of data that's out there on the internet now, misinformation and other things, that those are other areas that we probably have to be, careful with as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Can you share any examples of where artificial intelligence has caused some unintended consequences or harm? Obviously, you spoke about the potential for the, in the mortgage example. Are there other things you've seen out there where it's happened?
Yeah. So, I mean, lending, hiring, safety, I think just about anywhere, any place that it's impacting health, wealth, or livelihood of a human, you've seen those things. So, and they're derived from different things. So the lending is derived from a practice, at least in the US back, actually it was still going on, unfortunately, in some cases, even though it's illegal, called redlining, which is where, realtors and mortgage brokers, kind of classified areas, and they classified them as green, yellow, red, hence the term redlining. The green was people that look like you and I, white men, right? The yellow was, more affluent, maybe I'm Jewish, so Jews like myself, right? And then the red areas were, Black and brown people. And as I said, that data now, that bias, that intentional bias now lives in the data we're using to make these decisions. So that's one type of bias that occur, one type of harm that can occur is, intentional things that we've done in the past that are now surfaced in the data. Other types are from lack of data. So for instance, in the US, and actually pretty much in the West, what we call the Western world, people of color seek healthcare at a much lower rate than white people do. And in fact, people of color tend to only seek, and the overgeneralization, but if you summarize the data, it holds, only tend to seek help when there's an emergency. And so when we look at disease progressions, when we look at preventing disease, there are these huge gaps that are hard to fill in for these populations. And I mentioned I'm a human geneticist. Back when we were sequencing the human genome and doing all these studies on the human genome, the initial studies was done on two single white men, right?
Wow.
Two white dudes, right? Both of them of English, Irish descent. And so the amount of representation in that data in those sequences were essentially zero. And in fact, we had to go back afterwards and start incorporating information from other populations, and it didn't really scale, right? So it was very limited populations that were included. And so that's another type of data. Then look at, medical studies. For years, there were no requirement that there was any diversity in these medical studies. So most of what we think about as medical knowledge is based on, again, people that look like you and I, white dudes, not even women, right? Women and people of color and people of other, ethnicities and backgrounds were not included in these studies. And so, I think those are just a few kind of spattering of examples where we've got a lot of work to do, and we have to really think hard and deliberately about how we address those problems. Again, when we're working on specific use case, thinking about who's being impacted by that AI.
It's funny because when you think of the diversity gap, right, that, for certain generations, I think the gap is getting smaller, right? And in their shared experience, because they're younger, they haven't necessarily either been involved with or seen some of the things that we've done to either deliberately or accidentally exclude other members of society, right? But the internet has a long memory. It crosses all of our generations, and it's collecting all of that data. And I'd never really thought about that before, right? That it's like, well, we seem to be trying to get into a better place every day. We're working at getting better with diversity. But that doesn't mean the history and the legacy isn't there for the machine, which doesn't have that filter, right? Like to understand what is, right or wrong.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. We're getting to the point where we can teach the machine what types of biases we don't want it to learn to surface, right? Again, when we're doing these massive models, we don't want to build them over and over again. But we need to, when we're using them and applying them, we need to be able to teach them to constrain themselves so that they're not resolving these things. And which, this all gets back to, why I joined the Responsible AI Institute. Is the whole point of the Responsible AI Institute is we're focused on building, again, what we call conformity assessments, which are aligned to global standards, which help demonstrate that an AI is built responsibly. And there's, and it doesn't have a certain amount of bias. It dictates what are the protected classes. So protected classes, are those classes that you don't want, are historically been biased against and you want to measure. And then what are the parameters, what are the control factors that need to be there for those protected classes? And so and then a level of explainability, we bring in things like consumer protection, make sure the system, so the whole organization is set up for this properly. And so these types of assessments, again, delivered by a nonprofit to help organizations of any kind be able to understand and attest to the whole world that this AI is built in a responsible manner.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I'm currently the president for the Managed Print Service Association, another not-for-profit volunteer organization, and I think it's really important to have people like you that are leading the charge in those kind of organizations with only one goal in mind, and that's simply to make it better, right? Yeah. And you did mention, and I was thinking about this actually when we talked about biases, that obviously, part of, I think, the reason that OpenAI is letting so many people play with their system right now is to help train the system, right? To, get some feedback and to learn. And you mentioned that we can teach it, about bias and stuff. So it does have that ability where it can learn sort of appropriate responses, et cetera. Is that
so,
right?
So no, today you need a human to tell it to.
Okay.
We are getting to a point where we can, so that's basically reasoning, right? And so okay. AI today cannot reason, or at least this type of AI. There is a whole other field of AI that's been, going in parallel. The problem is we haven't figured how to we're just now beginning to figure out how do we use these two types of AI together. And it's called, neurosymbolic learning or logical neural nets. These types of things you can teach it to reason. And so it could reason in a given use case. We don't want this type of bias surfacing. We don't want this type of talk surfacing. We're not quite there yet. I'd say give it, less than 3 to 5 years. I think we'll start seeing this surfacing. And having been at IBM, which has the largest research organization in the world, they're doing a lot of work on this, which is how I got introduced to it. I think Microsoft and Google and others are doing a lot of work on this as well, as are academic institutions, as you can imagine, like MIT.
Well, it's good to know that. And I think it really helps people understand that, when we kind of joke and laugh about the rise of the machine, right? With the James Cameron Terminator movies, that, we're not quite there yet. And good to understand that these things have to be constrained by human beings. And that probably leads into the next question. What's the role of regulation? What's the role of, making sure that we, put guardrails in place, or should we put guardrails in place for what people are allowed to do with AI?
Yeah, so I think anytime AI, again, impacts the health, wealth, or livelihood of a human, there needs to be regulation. I mean, full stop. I think, how we regulate that, I think what the specific regulations are, there's the EU AI Act that's coming out, and they have kind of high, low, medium risk and prohibited classes. I think that's a good place to start. I think the challenge is, how do you plug your specific use case into there? But I think absolutely there needs to be regulation. The regulation is coming from consumer demand, from citizen demand. I think, corporations, some of them would do this well, some of them maybe not. So we need some protection for us, because there's a lot of harm that can come to us. We talked about only a small portion of that harm that can come to us. What we do need, though, is consistency among regulations. So, I think there's a challenge for organizations that are global or even regional. It becomes a, almost intractable problem. How do I make sure I'm complying to all the regulations? The other thing we need is, these regulations don't really tell you how you comply. And so there are standards evolving, like ISO standard that's almost done, a NIST standard, an IEEE standard, a UCAS standard. So these are all kind of global and local standards bodies. It would be very helpful if the regulators said, if you are aligned to this ISO standard, you will comply with the regulation, so that they know exactly what they need to measure, because that's a challenge that needs to happen. And I think, another plug for the Ray Institute is, we manage a regulatory tracker that keeps track of all these regulations that are globally, and any, in the North America, so US and Canada, Europe and the UK, we provide impact assessments for them as well. So organizations and humans can understand what that means for them. We're a very small organization, so we can't do it for all the regulations globally. We had to start somewhere. So, yeah, I think I covered your question a little bit.
I think you have, and I think it's great that you are, like you said, starting the work of being able to give people at least a central resource to be able to attack that problem, right? And yeah, regulation, I know, is always such a tough and tricky customer, right? And it really depends on who you ask about what the validity is. But as I like to remind people, when we started in the Industrial Revolution, right, we had all kinds of power resources and stuff that exploded on regular basis and killed people. And although they were great for starting us, they did need some regulation for safety standards for how they were built, kind of, et cetera, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the pieces I left out for the regulation too is the regulation needs to be very precise. It's got to say, for this type of use case, right? It can't just be a regulation for AI, because back to what we were talking about with how you control for these things, you control it for the use case, right? You wouldn't regulate Microsoft Word, right?
No.
Or Google Docs, but you may regulate what people can write on those things, right? Again, you don't want people, distributing things about building a bomb, right? Or, how to kill someone, or maybe, I don't know, maybe you do, but right. But you don't regulate the word processing tool, you regulate the outcome.
I love that. That's very salient advice, right? That it really does depend on, what is being done. And I don't think a lot of people realize too, when you look at those tool sets, right, that even something like Word, which is doing predictive analytics for, next sentence or next word or whatever, right? Huh.
Yeah, and there's some bias in that too, right? I mean, it works better for some languages than others. It can also, Microsoft Word's pretty good, but some of these kind of autocomplete things, if you start talking about a nurse, it's going to say she afterwards, right? Or a doctor, it's going to say he. Or someone violent, it may come up with anyway, you get the point. And
Yeah.
so even these tools can be biased. And like I said, Microsoft's done a really good job of controlling this, as has Google and Apple. You don't see that in their tools very often. But I mean, even mundane things like that don't really harm us create micro harms, right? Like microaggressions, like we talk about in when people are discriminating or making places uncomfortable. The tools that we use that leverage AI can surface those microaggressions as well.
Yeah, and I did see some of that, particularly around the image generation, right? And I, like, a bunch of other people have played around with some of that, getting different pictures, myself done for avatars or, whatever you want to call them, right? And yet in certain circumstances, like you said, where there are biases towards genders, where what they were doing with the female versions, some of them are actually borderline inappropriate, right? So
yeah, it didn't show me with six-pack abs and no shirt. No. It would put a bikini on women in or very low cut tops, and yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I would have taken a six-pack picture though.
Yeah, I'll get one any way I can get it, for sure. In your opinion, what are some of the key considerations that should probably go into the design if people are actually doing this now? Because I got to think, if we start at the design level from the beginning, it's probably easier to control this, right? What do you think some considerations for folks working on these things from the start, would be?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that again we use GPT to generate these questions, right? And I've put my name in there specifically, and it picked up on the fact that over the course of the last half a dozen years, I've been talking about how important the design phase is, and how that is critical to getting not only the right business outcome, but the right human outcome. And how you go about designing it, I think we should take from the design community, right? So when someone does a user interface, a really good user interface, there's a process that designers follow for this. How do they extract what the user is going to be doing? How do they kind of make sure they understand? How do they iterate on that so that it's delivering the best possible outcome? And then how do they communicate the result? When we're building AI, we need designers in the process, right? We need people that understand, how do you extract this information? Design thinking is a great tool for that. How do you display the information? Having data journalists, right? Think New York Times or 538, upshot of New York Times, 538, Washington Post has groups. How do you convey that information in a compelling and engaging way? And I think though that's often missed. In fact, 6 years ago at IBM, I hired and defined the role of data journalist, because I thought this was so important that we have this person that can communicate that. And I can tell you, it was incredibly hard to find. I only found 3 people that had this skill. Right now, there's entire programs at universities based around this. And so, that impacts, again, getting back to, especially when it impacts health, wealth, and livelihood, we need to understand who is affected by the AI, and you need to design the system for the best outcome for them.
Well, that's great. And I like how you say that the field for people being able to do that is increasing already. It was about 2 years ago now, I think, I actually took an online design thinking course from Cornell U, right? It's just fascinating. Absolutely love the area. And again, for people to be, building kind of these pillars, if you will, for what's going forward. I think the user experience too, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were speaking to that a little bit about how it looks and how it's presented to the world as well, right? And
yeah, that's incredibly important, right? I mean, it's Google took off because of the simplicity of its user interface. Yeah. And I think, we need to start, and it was very obvious how you used it, right? And so we need to start thinking about how we do that so that people get the most value, and they display the results in a compelling way, right? I can scroll through a web page and understand exactly what I need, what I'm looking for, other search engines have tried and not done so well. I mean, I wouldn't even think about using Bing,
No.
right? I mean,
And it's totally UX. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and I like the privacy features of DuckDuckGo, but it doesn't quite cut it, right? And so I think, that is such an incredible part of a good experience. And that gets to, again, we need to start understanding how do we protect consumers in some of these things in the interface, right? How do we make sure the systems of operations, how do we make sure behind that there's accountability, so when something goes wrong, West is the person that's accountable for this. He's the one that's going to be wearing the orange jumpsuit when something goes wrong.
Yeah, and it's really important to have that traceability, right? And the world that I live in with Tigerpaw software, right? We do ERPs and basically business process automation for businesses. And some of the competitors in the space, there's no way to track who made changes within those systems, right? And to me, that seems archaic. Like I should be able to go back and, to your point, be able to flag Wes McDonald no matter where he was located in that process, if it was 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago, right? So
right, yeah, perfect blockchain, right? I mean, having immutable records is incredibly important for a lot of these things, and we often think of blockchain as cryptocurrency, but it's
right.
NFTs, but it's so much more value can be taken out of those for cases like this.
Yeah, it's the same with a lot of technologies, right? Bluetooth is another great example of a technology that, we think of for connecting our music players and everything else. But of course, it had a much broader application when it was initially developed. Yeah. Well, that's great. I cannot thank you enough for doing the interview today. And in respect for your time and to make sure that we can get you off and ready for the holidays, if there's one piece of advice you could maybe give to people out there as it comes to where we are with the AI right now and maybe responsible usage, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one piece of advice is, you need to have a way to measure how responsible your AI is. If you don't have a measurement system, you don't know what you're shooting for. And so I think, whether I hope you use the Responsible AI Institute's frameworks and conformity assessments, but even if you don't, I mean, there are standards out there that are developing from ISO and NIST, which we align to, and others. You should look at those and make sure that you understand you have a measurement system. And, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, it's responsible.ai, very, very simple. And, there's lots of information you can garner from our website and download to kind of see what this looks like.
Well, I can't thank you enough for the good work that you're doing in the space, and especially as it's progressing so quickly now, we're going to need more folks like you to make sure that we're staying on track. So very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And to everyone who took the time to either listen in or view us today on the video, I want to thank you very much. And remember, until next time, keep learning.